I'm Sarah, and 3 weeks before starting at Stanford University, I discovered my parents had stolen every penny of my college fund to cover my brother's gambling debts. When they tried to convince me to give up my dreams and settle for community college instead, I smiled. That smile terrified them more than any tantrum could have, because they had no idea what I had just set in motion. What happened next involved a phone call from Stanford's admissions office that my parents will never forget, and a lesson in why you should never underestimate the quiet ones who have been planning their escape all along. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Michelle Johnson, and for 17 years, I believed I was living in the perfect American family. We had the suburban house with the white picket fence, the golden retriever named Murphy, and parents who seemed genuinely invested in my future. Every achievement was celebrated, every milestone documented, and every dream encouraged. I was the daughter who brought home perfect report cards, spent Friday nights studying instead of partying, and had a clear vision of exactly where my life was headed. Growing up in Millbrook, Ohio meant everyone knew everyone else's business, but our family had always been the kind that other parents pointed to as an example. Dad ran Johnson Plumbing Solutions, a business he had built from nothing after dropping out of high school at 16 to help support his own family. He drove a modest pickup truck, worked with his hands, and took immense pride in providing a stable life for his wife and children. Mom worked part-time at the Millbrook Public Library, a job she genuinely loved despite the modest pay, because she said being surrounded by books and helping people find information gave her a sense of purpose. From my earliest memories, education was treated as sacred in our household. Dad would often tell me stories about the opportunities he had missed because he never finished his education, how he watched classmates go off to college while he stayed behind to work construction jobs. He spoke about those lost chances not with bitterness, but with determination that his children would have different options. Every night when he tucked me into bed, he would point to the framed photograph of Stanford University that hung on the wall opposite my bed and say, "That's where brilliant girls like you belong, Sarah Bear." I might have calloused hands, but my daughter is going to have letters after her name. The college fund became a family ritual that defined my childhood in the most beautiful way. Dad started it when I turned 5 with a ceremony that felt as important as Christmas morning. He presented me with a crisp $20 bill and explained that this was the first deposit into my future. We walked hand in hand to First National Bank, where Mrs. Henderson, the branch manager, helped us open what she called a dream account. Every birthday, every Christmas, every excellent report card, every award ceremony resulted in another deposit. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes $50, but the amount never mattered as much as the intention behind it. Our Saturday morning tradition began when I turned 8 and could better understand numbers and interest rates. Dad and I would drive to the bank together, often stopping at Murphy's Donuts first to share a chocolate-glazed pastry while we talked about my week at school. At the bank, we would sit in the customer service area while Miss Henderson printed out the account balance and explained how compound interest was making our money grow even when we weren't adding to it. Dad would point to the numbers and beam with pride, telling me how each dollar represented another door that would open for me in the future. These weren't just financial transactions, they were investments in possibility. Dad would spread out college brochures on our kitchen table and help me imagine what life might be like at different universities. We researched programs, calculated costs, and dreamed together about the career paths that would make me happy and financially independent. He never pressured me toward any particular field, but he was adamant that I would have choices he never had. The college fund represented freedom, opportunity, and the kind of security that came from being educated rather than just employed. My older brother Jake had always been a completely different person from me, and for most of our childhood, this felt like natural sibling diversity rather than a problem. Where I was methodical and focused, Jake was spontaneous and charismatic. While I spent afternoons doing homework and reading ahead in my textbooks, Jake was usually outside playing basketball with neighborhood friends, or charming his way out of chores with elaborate stories that made Mom laugh despite herself. Teachers described him as bright but unfocused, and report cards consistently noted that he had potential but needed to apply himself more consistently. Despite these differences, Our family dynamic felt balanced and loving. Dad worked with Jake on practical skills, teaching him plumbing basics and taking him on service calls during summer breaks. Mom helped him with creative projects and encouraged his natural storytelling ability. I was the academic achiever, Jake was the social butterfly, and our parents seemed to appreciate both of our contributions to the family ecosystem. There was never any sense that one of us was valued more than the other. We were just different types of success. Jake's charm was legendary in our small town. He could talk teachers into deadline extensions, convince shopkeepers to let him work off accidentally broken merchandise, and somehow always landed on his feet when his impulsiveness got him into trouble. Adults found him engaging and entertaining, classmates wanted to be around him, and even I had to admit that life was more interesting when Jake was around. He had the kind of magnetic personality that made people want to help him succeed, and for years, this seemed like a wonderful gift rather than a potential liability. When Jake graduated high school and headed to Ohio State University on a partial baseball scholarship, our family was thrilled. Dad talked proudly about having both children in college, even though my admission was still 2 years away. Mom sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and worried about whether Jake was eating enough vegetable. I was excited to have the house to myself for focused studying, but I also missed my brother's unpredictable energy. Video calls home were filled with Jake's entertaining stories about college life, roommate adventures, and the freedom of being on his own for the first time. During his freshman year, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Jake made the baseball team, maintained decent grades, and seemed to be thriving in the college environment. His calls home were full of enthusiasm about new friends, interesting classes, and the independence he was enjoying. Dad would get off the phone beaming with pride, telling Mom and me about Jake's latest adventures and accomplishments. It felt like proof that our family's approach to raising children was working exactly as intended. The first signs that something was wrong were so subtle that none of us recognized them as warnings. Jake's calls became less frequent, and when he did call, he seemed distracted and rushed. He stopped asking about my high school activities and Dad's business, instead focusing conversations on himself and his immediate needs. Requests for extra spending money became more common, usually accompanied by convincing explanations about textbooks, lab fees, or social activities that required additional funds beyond his meal plan and scholarship. Mom and Dad were happy to help with these requests because they remembered their own financial struggles during young adulthood and wanted to ensure Jake could focus on his studies, rather than worrying about money. They sent $50 here, $100 there, always accompanied by messages of love and encouragement. Jake expressed gratitude for their support and promised he was being responsible with the money, using it for exactly what he claimed to need. During Jake's sophomore year, the requests became more frequent and the amounts larger. He needed money for a laptop repair, then for supplemental tutoring, then for equipment required for a new major he was considering. Each request came with a detailed explanation and a promise that this would be the last time he needed help, beyond his regular allowance. Mom started picking up extra hours at the library to help cover these unexpected expenses, and Dad began working weekend service calls that he had previously turned down. The changes in our family's financial habits were gradual enough that they felt like temporary adjustments, rather than permanent shifts. Dad and I still maintained our Saturday morning bank visits, but they became less frequent as his work schedule intensified. Our conversations about my college fund became shorter, more focused on the numbers rather than the dreams behind them. When I asked about applying for additional scholarships or considering more expensive universities, Dad would remind me that we needed to be realistic about costs, and that state schools could provide excellent educations at more manageable price. I didn't question these changes because they seemed reasonable and because I trusted my parents completely. If Dad thought we needed to be more conservative with college planning, then that was probably the wise approach. If Mom needed to work extra hours to help Jake through a difficult period, then that was what supportive families did for each other. My focus remained on maintaining my perfect grades, participating in extracurricular activities, and preparing for standardized tests that would determine my college options. Jake's behavior during his rare visits home also began to change in ways that were concerning but not yet alarming. He seemed restless and anxious, always checking his phone and stepping outside to take calls that he claimed were about baseball or group projects. He was less interested in family activities and more focused on spending time with local friends who had reputations for questionable decision-making. When Dad tried to engage him in conversations about his future plans or career goals, Jake would deflect with jokes or change the subject entirely. The tension in our house during Jake's visits became palpable, though no one addressed it directly. Mom would fuss over Jake's appearance, noting that he looked thin and tired, while Dad would ask pointed questions about his grades and baseball performance that Jake answered with vague reassurance. I found myself feeling like an outsider during these interactions, watching my parents worry about my brother while trying to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. During my junior year of high school, Jake's calls home became increasingly erratic. Sometimes weeks would pass without any communication, followed by sudden phone calls where he seemed manic and overly talkative. Other times he would call multiple times in a single day with small requests or random thoughts that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. Mom started carrying her phone with her constantly, afraid she might miss an important call from Jake who might need immediate help with some crisis. The financial requests evolved from occasional needs to regular demand. Jake always had explanations for why he needed money, but the explanations became more elaborate and less believable. He claimed his scholarship had been temporarily reduced due to administrative errors that would be resolved soon. He said his meal plan wasn't covering all his nutritional needs, and he needed to buy supplements recommended by the baseball coach. He reported that his textbooks for advanced classes cost more than anticipated, and he needed funds immediately to avoid falling behind in his coursework. Each request was accompanied by expressions of gratitude and promises to pay the money back once his financial aid situation stabilized or once he found a part-time job that worked with his baseball schedule. Jake was convincing because he genuinely seemed to believe his own explanations, and because our family had always operated on trust and mutual support. The idea that Jake might be lying to us or manipulating our love for him was simply not something my parents could imagine. Dad began working longer hours and taking on projects he had previously considered too time-consuming or difficult. Mom increased her library hours and started tutoring students after work to bring in additional income. They never complained about these changes or made Jake feel guilty about needing extra support, but I could see the stress building in both of them. Dad's Saturday morning conversations became more focused on practical concerns than future dreams, and Mom's cheerful demeanor became more forced and fragile. The breaking point came during Jake's second semester of sophomore year when he called home in tears, claiming he had been robbed and needed emergency funds to replace stolen belongings and catch up on expenses. The story was dramatic and heartbreaking, involving a break-in at his apartment that had resulted in the loss of his laptop, textbooks, and several. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Months worth of rent money he had been saved. Jake sobbed on the phone, describing how violated and helpless he felt and begging Dad to wire money immediately so he could file police reports and begin replacing his essential item. Dad didn't hesitate to send the requested amount, nearly $3,000, that represented a significant portion of our family's emergency savings. Jake's gratitude was overwhelming, and he promised to provide police report numbers and insurance claim documentation as soon as everything was processed. He swore that this was the worst thing that had ever happened to him, but that he would learn from the experience and be more careful about security in the future. The police report never materialized, the insurance claims were never filed. When Dad asked follow-up questions about the robbery investigation, Jake became defensive and claimed that the police were incompetent and that his insurance company was giving him the runaround. Each explanation for missing documentation was plausible enough to avoid triggering immediate suspicion, but the pattern of promises followed by excuses was becoming impossible to ignore. My parents began having hushed conversations in their bedroom that stopped abruptly when I appeared. Phone calls with Jake became exercises in careful questioning, followed by frustrated silences after he hung up. The atmosphere in our house shifted from supportive concern to anxious uncertainty, and I found myself wondering what information I wasn't being given about my brother's situation. The truth about Jake's gambling addiction exploded into our lives on a cold Thursday evening in March, when 3 men appeared at our front door asking to speak with Jake's parents about resolving a financial matter. These weren't bill collectors or bank representatives. They were large, serious men who spoke in calm, measured tones about money that Jake owed to their organization, and the importance of settling debts promptly to avoid escalating consequences. I watched from my bedroom window as Dad spoke with these men on our front porch, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to maintain composure. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes, during which Mom paced frantically in the living room, occasionally peering through the curtains with an expression of terror I had never seen on her face before. When Dad finally came back inside, his face was gray and he immediately called Jake, demanding that he come home immediately to explain what was happening. The explanation, when it finally came, was worse than any of us had imagined. Jake had discovered online poker during his freshman year, initially playing small stakes games with friends as a way to socialize and potentially earn spending money. What started as casual entertainment had evolved into a serious addiction that consumed increasingly large amounts of time and money. By his sophomore year, Jake was playing high-stakes games through connections he had made in his fraternity, borrowing money to cover losses with the conviction that the next game would allow him to break even. The men who had visited our house represented a gambling ring that operated through several fraternities at Ohio State, providing credit to students who wanted to play in games with stakes far beyond their financial means. Jake owed them $75,000, an amount that had accumulated over 18 months of increasingly desperate attempts to win back previous losses. The organization was not interested in payment plans, partial settlements, or promises about future earnings. They wanted their money immediately, and they had made it clear that failure to pay would result in consequences that extended beyond Jake to his family. Dad's decision to empty my college fund was made that same night, while I was supposedly sleeping, but actually listening to my parents' anguished conversation through the thin walls of our house. Mom sobbed about the impossibility of the situation, while Dad spoke in broken sentences about his responsibility to protect his son, and his inability to see any other solution. The college fund represented the only liquid asset our family possessed in sufficient quantity to satisfy Jake's creditors, and Dad convinced himself that sacrificing my future was temporary while the threats to Jake's safety were immediate. The next morning, Dad went to First National Bank and withdrew every penny of the $87,000 we had accumulated over 13 years of careful saving and compound interest. Ms. Anderson, the branch manager who had helped us open the account when I was 5 years old, asked if everything was all right and whether this withdrawal was related to my upcoming college application. Dad lied and told her that we were moving the money to a higher yield investment account that would provide better returns for my education expenses. Jake's debts were paid that afternoon, and the immediate threat to our family's safety was resolved. But the cost was my entire future, erased in a single transaction that Dad convinced himself was the only possible choice. That evening, my parents sat me down and explained that there had been complications with my college fund that would require us to explore alternative options for my education. They spoke in euphemisms and vague language, unwilling to admit the full scope of what they had done or to acknowledge that Jake's addiction had consumed my dreams, along with our family's financial security. The weeks following the revelation about my stolen college fund felt like living in a house made of lies that were slowly crumbling around me. My parents tried to maintain the illusion that everything would work out fine, that this was just a temporary setback that we would overcome together as a family. They spoke about community college as if it were a strategic choice rather than my only remaining option, and they treated Jake's gambling addiction as if it were a medical condition that had struck our family randomly rather than a series of deliberate choices that had destroyed my future. Dad threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on manic, taking on every available job and working 16-hour days as if sheer effort could somehow undo what had been done. He would come home exhausted and covered in grime, barely speaking during dinner before collapsing in front of the television until bedtime. When I tried to talk to him about my college applications or my scholarship opportunities, he would get a haunted look in his eyes and mumble something about needing to focus on immediate problems before we could think about the future. Mom's response was to become aggressively cheerful about my new opportunities at Millbrook Community College, researching their programs with the same enthusiasm she had once shown for Stanford and Harvard brochures. She would corner me in the kitchen with printouts about their nursing program or their business administration track, chattering about how I could complete my general education requirements for a fraction of the cost and then transfer to a 4-year university for my final 2 years. Her forced optimism was more painful than Dad's obvious guilt, because it required me to pretend along with her that this was somehow a positive development. Jake, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a bubble of relief and selective amnesia about the chaos he had caused. The immediate threat to his safety had been eliminated, and he appeared to believe that this meant the crisis was over and life could return to normal. He got a job working for Dad's plumbing business, but his work ethic was inconsistent and his attention was constantly divided by his phone, which buzzed with notifications that he would check secretively throughout the day. When I confronted him about the impact his gambling had on my college plans, he looked genuinely confused, as if the connection between his debts and my stolen fund was not obvious to him. The most devastating part of this new reality was watching my parents reorganize their entire worldview to accommodate Jake's needs, while minimizing the significance of what I had lost. They spoke about my college fund as if it had been their money to spend, rather than 13 years of deposits that had been specifically designated for my education. They treated my anger and disappointment as selfishness, suggesting that a good daughter would be more concerned about her brother's well-being than her own educational opportunity. During family dinners, the conversation would inevitably turn to Jake's recovery and his efforts to rebuild his life, while my achievements at school or my college acceptance letters were treated as secondary concerns that could wait until we had addressed the more pressing family crisis. When I received my acceptance letter from Stanford with a partial scholarship, my parents' response was a distracted "congratulations," followed immediately by a conversation about whether Jake was attending his counseling sessions regularly. The financial reality of our situation became increasingly clear as the weeks passed. Dad's business, which had always provided a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, was now stretched beyond its limits by the debt he had taken on to cover Jake's gambling loss. The second mortgage on our house meant that our monthly expenses had increased significantly, just as Dad was struggling to rebuild the savings that had been wiped out by my brother's addiction. Mom's library salary, which had always been supplemental income, was now essential for covering basic household expenses. My own financial situation was equally dire. The partial scholarship to Stanford covered about 60% of the total costs, leaving me responsible for approximately $40,000 per year in tuition fees, housing, and living expenses. Without my college fund, this amount was completely impossible to manage through student loans alone, even if I worked part-time throughout my college year. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and undeniable, and my parents' suggestion that I attend community college for 2 years was based on economic reality rather than educational preference. The social dynamics in our small town added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the news of Jake's gambling problems had spread through informal networks of gossip and speculation. Some people were sympathetic, treating our family's crisis as the kind of tragedy that could strike anyone. Others were judgmental, suggesting that Jake's addiction was a reflection of poor parenting or moral failure that the Johnson family had brought upon themselves. The most painful conversations were with adults who had known me since childhood and who expressed genuine sadness about my college prospects being derailed by circumstances beyond my control. Miss Patterson, my guidance counselor, was particularly devastated when I explained that Stanford was no longer financially feasible. She had written recommendation letters and helped me navigate the application process with the assumption that my college fund would make my top choice schools accessible. Learning that 13 years of careful planning had been destroyed overnight left her speechless and visibly angry on my behalf. My classmates' reactions ranged from sympathy to awkwardness to barely concealed relief that their own college competition had been reduced by one highly qualified candidate. Some friends offered genuine support and encouragement, while others seemed uncomfortable discussing college plans in my presence, as if my situation were contagious or somehow embarrassing. The seniors who had been accepted to prestigious universities were particularly awkward around me, unsure whether to share their excitement about their college plans or to avoid the topic entirely out of sensitivity to my circumstance. The hardest part was maintaining my academic performance while processing the emotional devastation of having my future stolen by the people who were supposed to protect it. My teachers expected the same level of excellence I had always delivered, and my college applications required essays and interviews where I needed to project confidence and optimism about my future plan. I found myself living in two realities simultaneously: the public version where I was still a successful student with bright prospects, and the private version where I was struggling to reimagine my entire life within the constraints of my family's financial destruction. Sleep became increasingly difficult as my mind raced through various scenarios and calculations, trying to find some mathematical combination that would make Stanford feasible despite my family's betrayal. I researched work-study programs, additional scholarship opportunities, and the possibility of taking gap years to work and save money before starting college. Every option seemed to involve significant compromises or delays that would fundamentally alter the trajectory I had planned so carefully throughout high school. The relationship with my parents deteriorated steadily as I struggled to process their choice to prioritize Jake's immediate crisis over my long-term future. They seemed to expect gratitude for the sacrifices they were making to rebuild our family's financial stability, and they interpreted my anger and disappointment as ingratitude for everything they had provided throughout my childhood. Our conversations became increasingly strained, with them defending their decision as the only possible choice and me pointing out the long-term consequences of destroying my educational opportunities to enable Jake's addiction. Jake's presence in our house became a constant reminder of the cost of his choices and our parents' willingness to absorb those costs at my expense. He seemed genuinely unaware of the resentment building around him, or perhaps he was simply skilled at ignoring emotional cues that made him uncomfortable. When he talked about his plans to return to college once he had saved enough money working for Dad, I wanted to scream about the irony of him having multiple chances to pursue education while my single opportunity had been sacrificed to pay for his mistake. The most frustrating aspect of this entire situation was my parents' insistence that family loyalty required me to support their decision and to minimize my own losses for the sake of family harmony. They wanted me to be understanding about Jake's addiction, grateful for their protection of him, and optimistic about alternative educational paths that would still allow me to achieve my goals eventually. They seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't more willing to sacrifice my immediate college plans to help solve a crisis that Jake had created through his own irresponsible choices. As spring semester progressed and college enrollment deadlines approached, the pressure to make definitive decisions about my future intensified. Stanford required a deposit and a commitment by May 1st, which meant I needed to either find a way to finance my education or formally decline their acceptance and forfeit the partial scholarship they had offered. Community college required different paperwork and had later deadlines, but attending there would mean giving up not just Stanford but also the momentum and connections that came from starting at a prestigious university as a freshman. The emotional toll of this decision-making process was exhausting. Every conversation about college became a reminder of what I had lost and what I would continue to lose if I couldn't find a solution. My parents' well-meaning suggestions about community college felt like constant pressure to accept a diminished future, while my own research into financial aid and scholarship opportunities felt increasingly desperate and unlikely to succeed. During this period, I began to notice subtle changes in my own personality and worldview that reflected the impact of my family's betrayal. I became more suspicious of people's motivations and more protective of my own interests. I started questioning whether the values my parents had taught me about family loyalty and sacrifice were actually healthy, or whether they were convenient beliefs that allowed people to exploit those who loved them. The trust I had always felt in my parents' judgment and protection was fundamentally damaged, leaving me feeling more alone and vulnerable than I had ever experienced. The breaking point in my relationship with my parents came during a family meeting they called in late March, ostensibly to discuss my college plans, but actually to pressure me into accepting community college as my only realistic option. They presented this choice as mature acceptance of our new financial reality, but I recognized it as their attempt to make themselves feel better about the consequences of their decision to prioritize Jake's crisis over my future. Dad spoke about the practical advantages of staying home for 2 more years, saving money on housing and meal plans, while completing general education requirements that would transfer to any four-year university. Mom talked about the quality of education available at community college and the success stories of students who had transferred to excellent universities after completing their associate degrees. Jake sat silently during this conversation, occasionally nodding as if he were participating in a family decision rather than being the cause of the crisis we were trying to solve. What they didn't understand was that accepting community college would mean giving up more than just Stanford. It would mean accepting that my dreams were less important than Jake's mistakes, that my 13 years of perfect grades and careful planning could be erased by someone else's irresponsible choices, and that family loyalty required me to absorb the consequences of decisions I had no part in making. It would mean starting my adult life from a position of compromise and resentment, rather than opportunity and optimism. Their expectation that I would gracefully accept this diminished future as a reasonable solution to our family crisis revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood both the value of what I was losing and the injustice of being forced to lose it. They saw my college fund as a family resource that could be redirected when necessary, rather than as my inheritance and my foundation for independence. They viewed my anger about this redirection as selfishness rather than as a legitimate response to having my future stolen without my consent. The conversation ended with me stating clearly that I would not be attending community college, and that I would find a way to attend Stanford with or without their support. My parents' reaction was a mixture of disappointment, frustration, and what appeared to be genuine surprise that I wasn't willing to accept their solution to the crisis they had created. They seemed to have convinced themselves that I would eventually see the wisdom of their approach and would choose family harmony over my individual ambition. That night, lying in bed and staring at the Stanford University photograph that still hung on my wall, I realized that my relationship with my parents had fundamentally changed. They were no longer the protectors and advocates I had always believed them to be. They were people who would sacrifice my future to solve problems they were unwilling to address honestly, and they expected me to be grateful for their willingness to make this sacrifice on my behalf. The anger I felt was different from any emotion I had experienced before. It wasn't the temporary frustration of a teenager who didn't get her way, but the deep, abiding fury of someone who had been betrayed by the people she trusted most. This anger was clarifying rather than confusing, because it helped me understand that I could no longer depend on my parents to protect my interests or to make decisions that reflected my value as their daughter. Jake's addiction had revealed something fundamental about our family dynamics that I had never recognized before. When crisis struck, my parents would protect him at any cost, even if that cost was my future. This wasn't necessarily because they loved him more than they loved me, but because they feared losing him in a way they didn't fear losing me. Jake's problems were dramatic and immediate, while my achievements were steady and reliable. In their crisis management, they had chosen to preserve the relationship that felt most fragile while taking for granted the relationship that felt most secure. This realization was devastating but also liberating, because it helped me understand that my survival and success would depend entirely on my own effort. My parents had shown me that their love was conditional on my willingness to accept whatever sacrifices they deemed necessary for family stability. Since I was unwilling to sacrifice my future for Jake's mistakes, I would need to build that future without their support or approval. The final weeks of my senior year became a period of intense planning and preparation for a life that would be fundamentally different from anything I had previously imagined. Instead of graduating with the security of a fully funded college education and my parents' enthusiastic support, I would be starting my adult life with damaged family relationships, significant financial challenges, and a clear understanding that my success would depend entirely on my own resourcefulness and determination. This transformation from protected daughter to independent young woman was painful but necessary. My parents had inadvertently taught me that I couldn't rely on anyone else to prioritize my dreams or to protect my interests when they conflicted with other family members' needs. This lesson was harsh, but it was also empowering, because it forced me to develop strengths and strategies I might never have discovered if my path to college had remained smooth and fully supported. The girl who had trusted completely in her parents' wisdom and protection was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love didn't always translate into support, and that family loyalty could be used as a weapon against the people who practiced it most faithfully. This new version of myself was harder and more calculating, but she was also more capable of surviving in a world where she couldn't count on anyone else's protection or advocacy. The morning after my confrontation with my parents about refusing community college, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't experienced since discovering my stolen college fund. The anger that had consumed me for weeks had crystallized into something more useful: determination. If my family wouldn't protect my future, then I would have to build it myself, brick by brick, with whatever resources I could gather through my own efforts. My first stop was the guidance office at Millbrook High School, where Mrs. Patterson had been my advocate throughout the college application process. When I knocked on her door at 7:30 that morning, she was already at her desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of transcripts, preparing for another day of helping seniors navigate their post-graduation transition. The expression on her face when she saw me told me that she had been expecting this conversation, though perhaps not quite this early in the morning. Ms. Patterson had been teaching and counseling at Millbrook High for 23 years, and she had seen every possible variation of family crisis that could derail a student's college plan. But she told me later that my situation was particularly heartbreaking because it involved such a dramatic reversal of fortune for a student who had done everything right. She had watched me work methodically toward my goals for 4 years, never doubting that my college fund and my academic achievements would combine to create exactly the future I had planned so carefully. When I explained that I was determined to attend Stanford despite my family's financial catastrophe, Mrs. Patterson didn't try to talk me out of it or suggest more realistic alternatives. Instead, she pulled out a thick binder filled with scholarship information and began walking me through every possible source of funding that might bridge the gap between my partial Stanford scholarship and the full cost of attendance. We spent the next 2 hours creating a systematic plan for applying to dozens of private scholarships, many with deadlines that were rapidly approaching. The scholarship application process became my full-time obsession during the final months of my senior year. Every evening after school, I would spend hours researching foundations, corporations, and organizations that offered educational grants to students who met specific criteria. I applied for scholarships based on academic merit, financial need, geographic location, intended major extracurricular activities, community service, and any other qualifying factor that might distinguish me from the thousands of other desperate students competing for the same limited funds. Each application required essays, letters of recommendation, transcripts, and detailed financial information that documented my family's inability to support my college education. Writing these essays forced me to articulate my goals and my determination in ways that were both inspiring and exhausting. I had to present myself as deserving and ambitious while simultaneously explaining why my family couldn't fulfill their basic obligation to support my education after 13 years of promising to do exactly that. The most challenging part of this process was requesting letters of recommendation from teachers and community members who knew my family's situation. I had to explain why I needed these letters so urgently and why my college funding had suddenly become problematic, which meant revealing details about Jake's gambling addiction and my parents' decision to sacrifice my education to solve his crisis. These conversations were humiliating but necessary, and most of the adults I approached were genuinely outraged on my behalf and eager to help however they could. My English teacher, Mr. Davidson, wrote what he later told me was the most passionate recommendation letter of his career, describing my resilience and determination in the face of family betrayal. My calculus teacher, Miss Wong, emphasized my analytical thinking and problem-solving abilities, suggesting that my response to this crisis demonstrated exactly the kind of character that would lead to success in any field I chose to pursue. Even our family pastor, Reverend Martinez, agreed to write a letter despite his obvious discomfort with the family conflict that had prompted my request. While I was pursuing scholarships with manic intensity, I also needed to address the immediate financial reality of supporting myself through college even if I managed to secure enough funding to cover tuition and housing. This meant finding employment that would provide income during school breaks and potentially during the academic year if my course load permitted. The job market in Millbrook was limited, but I was willing to take any work that would contribute to my financial independence. My first job was at Riverside Cafe, a family-owned restaurant that served breakfast and lunch to local workers and travelers passing through our town on Highway 33. The owner, Miss Cheen, was a first-generation immigrant who had built her business through decades of 18-hour workdays and careful attention to every detail of the operation. She hired me as a weekend server with the understanding that I would be available for additional shifts during school breaks and summer vacation. Working at Riverside Cafe taught me skills that had nothing to do with food service but everything to do with survival. Miss Cheen expected excellence in every aspect of the job, from memorizing the menu and understanding dietary restrictions, to managing difficult customers and maintaining perfect cleanliness standards during rush period. She didn't tolerate excuses or complaints, but she also provided the kind of mentorship that came from someone who understood what it meant to build a life from nothing through sheer determination and hard work. The physical demands of restaurant work were challenging after years of focusing primarily on academic achievement, but I discovered that I enjoyed the immediate feedback and tangible results of this kind of labor. When I served a meal correctly and efficiently, the customer was satisfied and I received a tip that contributed directly to my college fund. When I cleaned tables thoroughly and maintained organized workstations, the restaurant operated more smoothly and Miss Chen trusted me with additional responsibilities that came with higher pay. My coworkers at Riverside Cafe were a mix of local high school students, earning spending money, and adults who depended on service industry income to support their family. Working alongside people who were managing real financial pressure gave me perspective on my own situation and taught me that my college ambitions, while important to me, were not necessarily more valuable than their own goals and struggle. This humility was important for my character development, even though it was sometimes painful to acknowledge. The hardest part of working at the restaurant was managing the physical and emotional exhaustion that came from combining full-time academic responsibilities with part-time employment. I would wake up at 5:30 on Saturday mornings to work the breakfast shift, then spend Saturday evening writing scholarship essays or studying for advanced placement exams. Sunday shifts were followed by homework sessions that extended well past midnight, leaving me perpetually tired but determined to maintain the academic standards that would justify my scholarship applications. Ms. Chen noticed my dedication and my obvious financial motivation, and after several months of reliable performance, she offered me additional responsibilities that came with better pay. I became responsible for training new servers, managing inventory for certain menu items, and occasionally filling in for the assistant manager during busy periods. These experiences taught me practical skills about leadership, organization, and customer service that would serve me well in college and beyond. My second job was tutoring younger students in mathematics and science, which paid better than restaurant work but required more scheduling flexibility. Mrs. Patterson helped me connect with parents who were looking for academic support for their children, and word of mouth quickly generated more clients than I could accommodate while maintaining my other responsibilities. Tutoring was intellectually satisfying in ways that restaurant work wasn't, and it helped me maintain my academic sharpness while earning money for college. The tutoring relationships also provided emotional benefits that I hadn't anticipated. Working with middle school and high school students who were struggling with concepts that came naturally to me reminded me of my own academic strengths and reinforced my confidence about succeeding in college, despite the obstacles I was facing. Many of my tutoring clients were dealing with their own family challenges, and helping them navigate academic difficulties while managing personal stress gave me perspective on resilience and problem-solving that extended far beyond mathematics and science. One of my regular tutoring clients was Emma Rodriguez, a freshman who was brilliant but struggling with severe test anxiety that was undermining her performance in advanced classes. Emma's parents had immigrated from Mexico and were working multiple jobs to provide opportunities for their children that they had never had themselves. Emma felt enormous pressure to justify her parents' sacrifices through academic achievement, but the pressure was actually interfering with her ability to demonstrate her knowledge on exams and assignments. Working with Emma taught me about the different ways that family expectations could create both motivation and obstacles for students who were trying to build better lives through education. Emma's parents supported her unconditionally and would have been proud of her regardless of her grades, but she had internalized their sacrifices as a debt that could only be repaid through perfect academic performance. This perspective helped me understand that my own family's betrayal, while devastating, had actually freed me from certain types of pressure that could be equally limiting. Through tutoring Emma and other students, I developed a clearer understanding of my own strengths and interests. I discovered that I was particularly good at breaking down complex problems into manageable steps, and at identifying the specific points where students were getting confused. I enjoyed the challenge of finding different ways to explain the same concept until I found an approach that clicked for each individual learner. These skills would prove valuable in college and in my eventual career, but more immediately, they gave me confidence that I could succeed academically regardless of the emotional turmoil in my family life. As spring semester progressed and scholarship notification deadlines approached, I maintained a careful spreadsheet tracking every application I had submitted, including deadline dates, required materials, and expected notification timeline. The waiting was almost unbearable, because each rejection letter narrowed my options while each acceptance brought me closer to making Stanford financially feasible. I tried to maintain realistic expectations about my chances, but I couldn't help calculating and recalculating different combinations of awards that might add up to sufficient funding. The first scholarship notification I received was a rejection from a foundation that provided grants to students pursuing careers in healthcare. The letter was polite but impersonal, explaining that they had received an overwhelming number of qualified applications and could only fund a small percentage of worthy candidates. I had expected rejections, but reading that first formal denial of my appeal for help was still emotionally devastating. It felt like confirmation that my situation was hopeless and that my determination to attend Stanford was naive rather than admirable. Fortunately, the second notification was an acceptance for a scholarship from the Millbrook Community Foundation, which provided $2,000 annually to local students who demonstrated academic excellence and financial need. $2,000 was a significant amount for my family's budget, but it was still far short of what I needed to make Stanford feasible. However, receiving this acceptance gave me hope that other organizations might also recognize my qualifications and be willing to invest in my education. Over the following weeks, I received a mixture of acceptances and rejections that gradually accumulated into a substantial but still insufficient funding package. The local Rotary Club offered a $1,500 scholarship for students pursuing careers in business or entrepreneurship. The Ohio Association of Women in Science provided a $3,000 grant for female students majoring in STEM fields. A regional foundation focused on first-generation college students contributed $2,500 toward my educational expense. Each scholarship acceptance was accompanied by a letter explaining the selection committee's reasoning and expressing confidence in my potential for success. Reading these letters was emotionally overwhelming, because they represented validation from adults who didn't know me personally but who believed that my academic achievements and my determination to overcome family obstacles made me worthy of their investment. These strangers were willing to support my education when my own parents had sacrificed it for my brother's mistake. By mid-April, I had accumulated approximately $12,000 in scholarship funding, which was substantial but still left me nearly $30,000 short of what I needed for my first year at Stanford. The mathematics of the situation remained brutal, and I was running out of time to find additional funding sources or to identify alternative solutions. My parents continued to pressure me to accept community college as the only realistic option, pointing out that my scholarship search was proving their point about the impossibility of financing a Stanford education. The emotional toll of this prolonged uncertainty was exhausting. I was maintaining perfect grades while working 2 part-time jobs and spending every free moment on scholarship applications, all while living in a house where my parents treated my determination as stubborn foolishness and my brother's presence served as a constant reminder of why my dreams had been sacrificed. I was sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, and struggling to maintain the optimistic facade that scholarship committees wanted to see in their essays and interviews. During this period, I also had to navigate the social complexities of my senior year while keeping my family's financial crisis private. My classmates were excitedly planning for college, sharing acceptance letters and scholarship awards, and discussing their future plans with the assumption that everyone would be able to attend their preferred university. I participated in these conversations while carefully avoiding details about my own situation, which meant constantly redirecting discussions and deflecting questions about my college preparation. The hardest social moments were interactions with friends whose families were financially supporting their college educations without question or sacrifice. These friends would complain about minor inconveniences, like having to choose between slightly different meal plan options or having to share a dormitory room with a stranger, while I was calculating whether I could afford to eat 3 meals per day if I managed to attend college at all. Their problems were valid within their own contexts, but listening to them required constant emotional regulation on my part. My closest friend, Jessica Martinez, was the only person outside of my family who knew the full extent of my situation. Jessica's family was middle class like mine had been, but they had been planning and saving for her college education since she was born, and they viewed supporting her university attendance as their primary parental responsibility. Jessica was horrified when I told her about my stolen college fund and my parents' decision to prioritize Jake's gambling debts over my educational future. Martinez offered to loan me money to help with college expenses, but I declined their generous offer because I knew they were already stretching their budget to support Jessica's education, and because I didn't want to risk damaging our friendship if I wasn't able to repay them quickly. However, their willingness to help, even when it would have created financial strain for their own family, highlighted the contrast between their values and my parents' choices. The most painful realization during this period was understanding that my parents' betrayal had damaged more than just my college prospects. It had fundamentally altered my ability to trust other people's promises and commitment. When teachers offered to write additional recommendation letters, or when scholarship committees expressed confidence in my potential, I felt grateful but also skeptical about whether their support would translate into actual help. My parents had taught me that even the most sincere promises could be broken when circumstances became difficult. This skepticism was probably healthy in some ways, because it motivated me to work harder and to have backup plans for every aspect of my college preparation. But it was also isolating because it made me reluctant to depend on other people's support even when that support was genuine and reliable. I was learning to be self-sufficient, but I was also learning to be alone in ways that weren't entirely necessary but felt emotionally safer after my family's betrayal. The contradiction of my situation was that I was simultaneously more independent and more vulnerable than I had ever been. I was handling complex financial decisions, managing multiple work schedules, and navigating institutional bureaucracies with confidence and competence that impressed the adults around me. But I was also 18 years old, living in a house where my own parents had demonstrated that my future was less important than my brother's immediate problems, and facing the possibility that my careful planning might not be sufficient to overcome the obstacles they had created. As the deadline for Stanford's enrollment deposit approached, I realized that I would need to make a decision based on incomplete information and imperfect options. I could accept the financial risk of attending college with insufficient funding, hoping that additional scholarships or work opportunities would materialize once I was enrolled. I could defer admission for a year while working to save money and applying for additional funding, though this approach carried its own risks and uncertainty. Or I could accept defeat and follow my parents' advice to attend community college, which felt like surrendering my dreams to accommodate their poor decision. The weight of this decision was overwhelming, because it would determine not just my immediate future but also the trajectory of my entire adult life. The choice between financial security and educational opportunity was one that no 18-year-old should have to make alone, but my family's betrayal had forced me into exactly that position. I was learning that adulthood sometimes meant making impossible choices with insufficient resources and imperfect information, and that the people who were supposed to guide and support me through these decisions were sometimes the source of the problems I was trying to solve. The breakthrough that changed everything came from an unexpected source and at the most desperate moment of my senior year. With only 2 weeks remaining before Stanford's enrollment deadline and still $28,000 short of what I needed, I had begun mentally preparing myself to defer admission and spend a gap year working to save money. The scholarship applications had yielded significant funding but not enough, and my parents had made it increasingly clear that they expected me to abandon my college plans and accept community college as the practical solution to our family's financial crisis. On a particularly stressful Tuesday evening in late April while I was working the dinner shift at Riverside Cafe, Mrs. Chen approached me during a brief lull between the after-work crowd and the evening diner. She had been observing my work performance and my obvious anxiety about college funding for several months, and she had occasionally asked questions about my situation that suggested she was more invested in my success than a typical employer might be. That evening she invited me to join her in the small office behind the kitchen where she handled the restaurant's administrative work. Mrs. Chen's office was cramped but meticulously organized, with filing cabinets containing years of business records and a desk covered with invoices, supply orders, and scheduling charts. She gestured for me to sit in the single chair across from her desk while she remained standing, a habit that reflected her preference for brief, efficient conversations that focused on practical solutions rather than extended emotional discussion. Her approach to both business and personal relationships was characterized by this kind of directness, which I had come to appreciate during my months of working for her. What Miss Chen told me that evening fundamentally changed my understanding of both my employment situation and my college prospects. She explained that she had been following my scholarship efforts with great interest and that she had been researching options for supporting my education through her business connections and personal network. As a first-generation immigrant who had built her successful restaurant through decades of hard work and careful financial planning, she understood both the value of education and the obstacles that could prevent deserving students from accessing higher learning opportunities. Mrs. Chen revealed that she served on the advisory board of a regional foundation that provided educational grants to students who demonstrated exceptional determination in overcoming family or financial obstacles. This foundation, the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund, specifically sought candidates whose personal stories illustrated resilience and character development through adversity. Mrs. Chen had been discussing my situation with other board members for several weeks, and she believed that my response to my family's betrayal and my systematic approach to financing my own education made me an ideal candidate for their largest annual scholarship. The Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund had been established by a group of successful business owners who had themselves overcome significant obstacles to achieve education and prosperity. Their scholarship program was designed to identify students who possessed not just academic ability, but also the kind of personal strength and determination that predicted long-term success regardless of the specific field they chose to pursue. The foundation's approach was highly selective, typically funding only 3 or 4 students per year, but their awards were substantial enough to cover full college expenses for recipients who maintained a satisfactory academic progress. Mrs. Chen explained that the foundation's application process was different from the traditional scholarship programs I had been pursuing throughout the spring. Rather than focusing primarily on grades, test scores, and extracurricular activities, they required a comprehensive presentation where candidates described their personal challenges, their response strategies, and their long-term goals in the context of their lived experiences. The selection committee wanted to understand not just what students had accomplished, but how they had grown through adversity and what they planned to contribute to their communities after graduation. The application deadline for the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund had technically passed, but Mrs. Chen's position on the advisory board allowed her to recommend exceptional late candidates who warranted special consideration. She offered to sponsor my application and to provide a detailed recommendation based on her observations of my work ethic, my character under pressure, and my systematic approach to solving the financial crisis that had threatened my educational goal. Her endorsement would carry significant weight with the selection committee, but the presentation and interview process would be entirely my responsibility. Ms. Chen gave me exactly 1 week to prepare a 20-minute presentation that would either secure full funding for my Stanford education or confirm that I would need to pursue alternative plans. The timeline was tight, but it was also energizing, because it provided a concrete opportunity to take control of my situation, rather than simply waiting for external circumstances to determine my future. For the first time since discovering my stolen college fund, I felt like I had agency in determining the outcome of my college planning process. The presentation I developed for the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund required me to synthesize months of anger, disappointment, and determination into a coherent narrative that demonstrated personal growth and future potential. I had to be honest about my family's betrayal without appearing bitter or self-pitying, and I had to show how their choices had strengthened rather than diminished my commitment to my educational goal. The balance between vulnerability and strength was delicate, but it was also authentic to my actual experience of processing this crisis. I structured my presentation around three main themes that reflected different aspects of my response to discovering my stolen college fund. The first section focused on the immediate practical steps I had taken to address the financial crisis, including my scholarship research, my employment decisions, and my systematic approach to calculating and pursuing every possible funding source. This section demonstrated my problem-solving abilities and my willingness to work hard for goals that mattered to me. The second section addressed the emotional and relational challenges of navigating family conflict while maintaining my academic and professional responsibility. I discussed the difficulty of loving family members whose choices had harmed me, and the process of learning to protect my own interests without becoming bitter or cynical about human relationships in general. This section was the most vulnerable part of my presentation, but it was also the most important for demonstrating the kind of character development that the foundation valued. The third section outlined my long-term goals and my commitment to using my education to help other students who faced similar obstacles. I explained my intention to study educational policy and family financial counseling, with the eventual goal of developing programs that would help families make better decisions about education funding and help students navigate financial crises that threatened their academic goals. This section connected my personal experience to broader social issues and demonstrated my understanding of education as a tool for community improvement, rather than just individual advancement. Preparing this presentation forced me to articulate insights about my situation that I hadn't fully recognized before. I realized that my parents' betrayal, while devastating, had actually accelerated my personal development in ways that might ultimately serve me well throughout my life. I had learned to advocate for myself, to research complex systems, to manage multiple responsibilities simultaneously, and to maintain long-term focus despite short-term obstacles. These skills would be valuable regardless of my career path, and they had been developed through necessity rather than through academic study. I also recognized that my experience had given me genuine empathy for other students who faced family obstacles to their educational goals. Many scholarship committees talked about wanting to fund students who would give back to their communities, but my commitment to helping others navigate similar challenges was based on lived experience rather than abstract idealism. I understood viscerally how family financial decisions could derail carefully planned futures, and I had developed practical strategies for overcoming these obstacles that I could share with others. The interview process for the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund took place on a Saturday morning in early May at the Foundation's offices in Columbus, Ohio. The selection committee consisted of 5 successful professionals who had themselves overcome significant obstacles to achieve education and career success. Mrs. Sheen had briefed me about each committee member's background, which helped me understand their perspectives and tailor my presentation to address their likely concerns and interests. The committee chair was Dr. Patricia Williams, a physician who had grown up in poverty and financed her medical education through a combination of scholarships, loans, and work-study programs. Her questions focused on my specific strategies for managing the financial and emotional stress of pursuing higher education without family support. She seemed particularly interested in my employment experiences and how they had contributed to my personal development beyond their financial benefits. The second committee member was Ms. James Rodriguez, a successful attorney whose own family had initially opposed his educational aspirations because they feared that higher education would separate him from his cultural roots and family relationships. His questions addressed the challenge of maintaining family connections while pursuing goals that family members didn't understand or support. He wanted to know how I planned to rebuild my relationship with my parents and whether I held any resentment that might interfere with my future success. The third member was Ms. Lisa Chang, a software engineer who had immigrated to the United States as a teenager and had navigated higher education with limited English proficiency and no familiarity with American academic system. Her questions focused on my research methods and my systematic approach to identifying and pursuing funding opportunities. She was impressed by my spreadsheet tracking system and methodical application process, noting that these skills indicated strong organizational abilities that would serve me well in college and beyond. The fourth committee member was Dr. Michael Thompson, a business school professor who specialized in family financial planning and had written extensively about the impact of poor financial decisions on educational opportunity. His questions were the most challenging because he asked me to analyze my parents' decision-making process and to explain how I would help other families avoid similar mistakes. He wanted to understand whether I had developed insights that could be practically applied to family financial counseling. The final member was Mrs. Sarah Martinez, a high school principal who had spent her career working with students from challenging family situations. Her questions focused on my emotional resilience and my plans for maintaining mental health and family relationships while pursuing demanding academic goals. She seemed concerned about ensuring that scholarship recipients had adequate support systems and coping strategies for the inevitable stresses of college life. Each committee member's questions reflected their own experiences and expertise, but they all seemed genuinely interested in understanding my character and potential rather than testing my knowledge or challenging my story. The interview felt more like a professional consultation than an interrogation, and I left feeling confident that I had represented myself authentically and demonstrated the qualities the foundation was seeking in scholarship recipients. The notification process for the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund was remarkably efficient compared to the months of waiting I had experienced with other scholarship programs. Ms. Chen had warned me that the committee made decisions quickly and communicated results within 1 week of interviews, which meant I would know my funding status before Stanford's enrollment deadline. This timeline was both reassuring and terrifying, because it meant that my college plans would be definitively determined within just a few days. On the Thursday following my Saturday interview, Ms. Chen asked me to stay after my shift at Riverside Cafe for what she described as important news about your scholarship application. I had been checking my email obsessively for 3 days, so her invitation to discuss the foundation's decision in person suggested that the news was significant enough to warrant a face-to-face conversation. I hoped this meant good news, but I also prepared myself for the possibility that even this final opportunity had not materialized into sufficient funding. Ms. Chen's office felt different that evening, perhaps because she had cleared her desk of its usual clutter and had arranged 2 chairs facing each other rather than maintaining her typical standing position during our conversation. She seemed more formal than usual but also more excited, which suggested that whatever news she had to share was positive rather than disappointing. When she handed me a folder containing the foundation's official correspondence, her smile confirmed that my hopes were about to be realized. The letter from Dr. Patricia Williams, writing on behalf of the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund Selection Committee, informed me that I had been selected as one of 4 recipients of their annual scholarship award. The foundation would provide full funding for my undergraduate education at Stanford University, including tuition, fees, housing, meal plans, and a modest allowance for textbooks and personal expenses. The only requirements were maintaining satisfactory academic progress and participating in annual meetings, where scholarship recipients shared their experiences and provided input on the foundation's programs. Reading this letter was overwhelming in ways that I hadn't anticipated. The financial relief was enormous, obviously, but the emotional impact was equally significant. For months I had been fighting for my future while my own family treated my goals as unrealistic and selfish. The foundation's decision represented validation from successful adults who believed in my potential and were willing to invest in my education despite having no personal connection to me or obligation to help me. Ms. Chen explained that the selection committee had been particularly impressed by my systematic response to crisis and my commitment to helping other students navigate similar challenges. They viewed my employment experiences and my scholarship research as evidence of maturity and determination that predicted long-term success regardless of the specific career path I eventually chose. The foundation's investment was based on their confidence in my character and work ethic rather than just my academic achievement. The timing of this news meant that I could accept Stanford's admission offer with confidence and begin planning for my freshman year without the financial uncertainty that had dominated my senior year. More importantly, it meant that my parents' betrayal had not succeeded in derailing my educational goals or forcing me to accept a diminished future as the price of family loyalty. Their decision to prioritize Jake's gambling debts over my college fund had caused tremendous pain and stress, but it had not ultimately prevented me from achieving the dreams they had taught me to pursue. That evening, I called Stanford's admissions office to confirm my enrollment and to express my gratitude for their patience during my funding search. The admissions counselor I spoke with was genuinely excited about my scholarship award and mentioned that my persistence in pursuing education despite family obstacles had impressed several staff members who had been following my situation. She assured me that Stanford was committed to supporting students who demonstrated my level of determination, and that additional resources would be available if I encountered unexpected challenges during my college years. The conversation with my parents about the scholarship and my confirmed enrollment at Stanford was one of the most satisfying moments of my entire senior year. I had been planning this announcement carefully, wanting to present the information in a way that made clear both my success and their irrelevance to that success. When I called them into the living room for what I described as important news about my college plans, they assumed I was finally ready to accept their advice about community college and abandon my unrealistic Stanford aspiration. My mother's expression when I announced my full scholarship was a mixture of shock, relief, and what appeared to be genuine pride in my accomplishment. She had spent months worrying about my college prospects and feeling guilty about the role their financial decisions had played in jeopardizing my future. Learning that I had not only secured admission to Stanford but had also obtained funding without their assistance seemed to lift a burden she had been carrying since the college fund crisis began. My father's reaction was more complex and more revealing about the assumptions he had been making throughout this entire process. He seemed surprised that I had been capable of solving the financial crisis independently and almost disappointed that his prediction about Stanford being financially impossible had proven incorrect. His response suggested that he had been hoping I would fail to secure adequate funding, because my success made his decision to sacrifice my college fund appear unnecessary rather than inevitable. Jake's presence during this conversation added an element of irony that was deeply satisfying. He had been the beneficiary of our parents' willingness to sacrifice my future for his immediate needs, but my success in rebuilding that future without their help highlighted the contrast between our respective approaches to overcoming obstacles. Jake had solved his gambling crisis by allowing our parents to absorb the consequences, while I had solved my funding crisis through my own efforts and determination. The most important part of this conversation was establishing clear boundaries about our future relationship and my expectations for family interactions during my college year. I explained that I would be financially independent throughout my education, and that I expected our family relationships to reflect this independence. I would not be available to help solve future crises that resulted from poor financial decisions, and I would not tolerate any suggestions that my educational success created obligations to family members who had been unwilling to protect my opportunity. My parents' response to these boundaries was mixed, but they seemed to understand that their betrayal had fundamentally altered our relationship and that rebuilding trust would require respecting my autonomy rather than expecting gratitude for their belated support. They appeared relieved that my college plans were secured but also somewhat chastened by the realization that I had succeeded without their help and despite their obstacles. During the final weeks of my senior year, word of my scholarship and my Stanford enrollment spread through Millbrook High School and the broader community. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with teachers, classmates, and community members expressing genuine excitement about my success and pride in my determination. Many people mentioned that they had been following my situation and rooting for me to find a way to achieve my goals despite the family obstacles I had faced. Patterson, my guidance counselor, was particularly gratified by the outcome because she had invested significant time and energy in helping me navigate the scholarship process. She mentioned that my success would serve as inspiration and practical guidance for future students who faced similar family crises that threatened their educational goals. The strategies I had developed for researching funding opportunities and managing multiple applications would become part of her standard advice for students dealing with unexpected financial obstacles. The graduation ceremony at Millbrook High School felt different from what I had anticipated throughout my 4 years of high school. Instead of celebrating the completion of one phase of education and the beginning of another with my family's full support, I was acknowledging my transition to complete independence and the beginning of a college experience that I had secured entirely through my own effort. This independence was empowering but also somewhat lonely because it marked the end of my childhood reliance on my parents' guidance and protection. My valedictory speech focused on resilience and self-advocacy, themes that reflected my personal experience but also resonated with many of my classmates who had faced their own obstacles during their high school years. I talked about the importance of maintaining long-term focus despite short-term setbacks and about the strength that could be developed through necessity when external support was unavailable or unreliable. The response to this speech suggested that many students and families in our community had been dealing with similar challenges and found inspiration in hearing about successful strategies for overcoming them. The summer before my freshman year at Stanford was spent working full-time at Riverside Cafe and preparing for the academic and social challenges of college life. Miss Chen increased my responsibilities and my hourly wage, both as recognition of my improved skills and as her contribution to my college preparation fund. She also introduced me to other successful professionals in our region, who had overcome family obstacles to achieve educational success, creating a network of mentors who could provide guidance during my college year. These conversations with successful adults who had navigated similar challenges were invaluable for understanding what to expect during my transition to college and beyond. They helped me recognize that family betrayal, while painful, was not uncommon and that many people had built successful lives after learning that they could not depend on their families for support or protection. Their stories provided both practical advice and emotional encouragement for the independent life I was beginning to build. The most important insight I gained during this period was understanding that my parents' betrayal, while devastating, had actually accelerated my personal development in ways that would serve me throughout my life. I had learned to research complex systems, to advocate for myself with authority figures, to manage multiple responsibilities simultaneously, and to maintain focus on long-term goals despite short-term emotional turmoil. These skills would be valuable in any career I eventually chose and in any challenges I might face as an adult. When I finally arrived at Stanford for freshman orientation, I felt more prepared for independence than many of my classmates who had come from supportive families that had guided them through every step of the college preparation process. My experience with crisis management and self-advocacy had taught me to be proactive about seeking resources and support rather than waiting for help to be offered. This confidence served me well during the adjustment to college life and helped me build the kinds of relationships with professors and advisors that would be crucial for my academic success. The smile I had given my parents during our final confrontation about community college had been genuine, because it reflected my understanding that their power to control my future had been an illusion that I had allowed myself to believe. Once I recognized that my success depended entirely on my own efforts and determination, their approval or disapproval became irrelevant to my actual prospects. This realization was liberating in ways that extended far beyond college planning and influenced my approach to every relationship and challenge I would face as an adult. Looking back on this experience from the perspective of my successful college years, I understand that my parents' betrayal was actually a gift, though not one I would have chosen or appreciated at the time. It forced me to develop independence, resilience, and self-reliance at an earlier age than might have been necessary if my college fund had remained intact and my family's support had remained reliable. These qualities served me well not just in college but in every aspect of my adult life, and they gave me authentic empathy for other people who faced obstacles that required them to advocate for themselves. The foundation scholarship that funded my Stanford education led to internships, research opportunities, and career connections that would not have been available if I had attended community college or a less prestigious university. But more importantly, the process of earning that funding taught me that I was capable of achieving my goals regardless of external support or obstacles. This confidence influenced every decision I made during college and every challenge I faced in building my career, and it gave me the courage to pursue ambitious goals even when other people doubted their feasibility. Today, as a successful family financial counselor specializing in educational planning, I work with families who are facing decisions similar to the ones my parents made when Jake's gambling addiction threatened our family's stability. I help them understand that sacrificing one child's future to solve another child's crisis creates long-term problems that extend far beyond the immediate financial concern. My personal experience gives me credibility with these families and helps me guide them towards solutions that protect everyone's interests rather than simply transferring problems from one family member to another. The most satisfying part of my current work is helping students who discover that their college funds have been compromised by family financial decisions. I teach them the research strategies, advocacy skills, and emotional resilience techniques that I developed during my own crisis, and I help them understand that family betrayal, while painful, does not have to determine their future prospects. Many of these students go on to achieve educational and career success that exceeds what would have been possible if their original college plans had proceeded without obstacle. My relationship with my parents has evolved over the years into something more honest and realistic than the idealized trust I felt during my childhood. We maintain regular contact and genuine affection, but I no longer depend on their judgment or approval for important life decisions. They have expressed pride in my achievements and regret about the choices they made during Jake's crisis. But we all understand that our relationship was fundamentally changed by their decision to prioritize his immediate needs over my long-term future. Jake eventually overcame his gambling addiction through a combination of professional treatment and personal determination, but the process took several years and required him to face the full consequences of his choices rather than depending on our parents to absorb those consequences. His recovery was ultimately more complete and sustainable because he was forced to develop his own coping strategies and support systems rather than relying on family members to solve his problem. Our relationship today is cordial but distant because we both understand that his addiction cost me years of trust and financial security that can never be fully restored. The phone call from Stanford's admissions office that my parents received during my freshman year was one of the most satisfying moments of vindication I experienced during this entire process. The university had called to thank them for raising such an exceptional daughter and to inform them that I had been selected for additional honors and research opportunities based on my academic performance and my leadership in student organization. The irony of Stanford thanking my parents for supporting my education when they had actually tried to prevent it was not lost on any of us, and it served as a final confirmation that my determination to attend Stanford despite their obstacles had been the right decision. That phone call represented the completion of my transformation from a trusting daughter who depended on her parents' protection to an independent young woman who understood that her success would depend entirely on her own efforts and character. The smile I had given my parents when they tried to pressure me into accepting community college had been the beginning of this transformation, and Stanford's recognition of my achievements was the proof that my confidence in my own abilities had been justified. The moment I stepped onto Stanford's campus for freshman orientation, I felt the weight of everything I had fought for crystallizing into reality. The manicured lawns, the sandstone buildings, the energy of brilliant minds converging from around the world. This was the dream my father had planted in my 5-year-old heart. The future I had refused to surrender even when my own family had stolen the means to achieve. But standing there with my single suitcase and my carefully budgeted meal plan, I realized that the girl who had trusted her parents to protect her dreams was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most important promises are the ones you make to yourself. My freshman dormitory was Wilbur Hall, a modest building that housed students from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. My roommate Jennifer Liu came from a wealthy Silicon Valley family where college funding had never been a question, and parental support was assumed rather than earned. Jennifer's move-in day involved 3 cars, professional movers, and parents who stayed for hours arranging her side of the room with designer bedding and state-of-the-art electronics. My move-in day involved a single trip in my used Honda Civic,
a conversation with my resident advisor about work-study opportunities, and a quick phone call to Mrs. Chen to confirm that I had arrived safely. The contrast between Jennifer's preparation for college and my own highlighted the different paths that had led us to the same destination.
Jennifer had been guided through every step of the college application process by private counselors, test preparation specialists, and parents who viewed her Stanford admission as the natural result of years of careful planning and financial investment. Her biggest concern about college was choosing between multiple attractive options for extracurricular involvement. My preparation had been characterized by crisis management, financial uncertainty, and the constant awareness that my college attendance depended entirely on my own resourcefulness and determination. During our first weeks as roommates, Jennifer and I discovered that our different backgrounds created complementary strengths that enhanced both of our college experiences. Jennifer's familiarity with academic systems and social networks helped me navigate Stanford's complex institutional culture, while my experience with independent problem-solving and financial management helped her develop practical skills that her sheltered upbringing had not required. Our friendship became a model for how different types of preparation could lead to mutual support and shared success. The academic rigor at Stanford was intense, but manageable for someone who had spent senior year balancing perfect grades with multiple jobs and scholarship applications. My study habits, developed through necessity during the crisis period, proved more effective than those of many classmates who had never learned to maximize limited time or to maintain focus despite external stressors. While other freshmen struggled with the transition from structured high school environments to the independence of college learning, I thrived in an environment that rewarded self-direction and personal initiative. My professors quickly recognized my work ethic and my genuine intellectual curiosity, qualities that distinguished me from students who were academically capable but less motivated by intrinsic interest in learning. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my freshman seminar professor, became an important mentor who helped me understand how my personal experiences with family dynamics and financial stress could inform my academic interests in psychology and social policy. She encouraged me to view my background as an asset rather than an obstacle, and she helped me recognize how my crisis management skills could be applied to research and analysis. The work-study position I secured through Stanford's financial aid office was in the admissions department, where I helped process applications and assisted with campus tours for prospective students and their families. This job provided valuable insight into the college admissions process from the institutional perspective, but more importantly, it allowed me to observe hundreds of families navigating the financial and emotional complexities of college planning. Many of these families were dealing with circumstances similar to what my own family had faced, and I began to understand that my experience was part of a larger pattern of family financial dysfunction that affected educational opportunity. During campus tours, I frequently encountered parents who were asking detailed questions about financial aid, scholarship opportunities, and the real costs of college attendance. Some of these parents seemed genuinely committed to supporting their children's education regardless of the financial sacrifice required. Others appeared to be looking for ways to minimize their own financial obligations while maintaining the appearance of supporting their children's goals. My experience with my own parents had taught me to recognize the subtle signs that distinguish genuine support from conditional assistance that could be withdrawn when circumstances became difficult. The most heartbreaking tours were those that included families where parents and students had fundamentally different expectations about college funding and post-graduation financial responsibility. I would watch teenagers explaining their academic interests and career goals, while their parents calculated costs and discussed limitations that the students clearly had not anticipated. These interactions reminded me of my own naive assumptions about my college fund and my parents' commitment to my education, and they reinforced my determination to help other families avoid similar miscommunications and betrayal. My sophomore year brought opportunities to become more involved in Stanford's peer counseling and academic support program. The skills I had developed through necessity during my own crisis, research abilities, financial planning, emotional resilience, and systematic problem-solving, proved valuable for helping other students navigate various challenges. I was particularly effective at working with students who were dealing with family financial problems because I could provide both practical strategies and emotional support based on lived experience, rather than theoretical knowledge. The peer counseling training program required students to examine their own backgrounds and motivations for wanting to help others, a process that forced me to articulate how my family's betrayal had shaped my values and my goals. I realized that my determination to help other students avoid similar experiences was not just altruistic, but also therapeutic, because it allowed me to find meaning and purpose in the pain I had experienced. Helping others navigate family financial crises gave me a sense of agency and accomplishment that helped counterbalance the powerlessness I had felt when my own college fund was stolen. During my junior year, I declared a double major in psychology and economics, a combination that reflected my interest in understanding both the individual and systemic factors that influenced family financial decision-making. My academic advisor, Dr. Michael Chen, helped me design a course of study that would prepare me for graduate work in family financial counseling or policy development. He was impressed by my ability to connect theoretical concepts to real-world applications, a skill that had been developed through my experience of navigating complex financial and emotional challenges without adequate family support. My senior thesis research focused on the long-term impact of family financial betrayal on young adults' educational and career outcomes. I interviewed dozens of students who had experienced various forms of family financial dysfunction, from parents who had stolen college funds to families who had withdrawn promised support due to changing circumstances. The patterns I identified through this research confirmed many of my own observations about the relationship between family financial decisions and educational opportunities, and the thesis won recognition from both the psychology and economics department. The research process also provided personal validation for my own experience and my response to my family's betrayal. Many of the students I interviewed had responded to family financial crises with depression, anger, or resignation that had limited their ability to pursue alternative solutions. The characteristics that had enabled me to overcome my circumstances: systematic research skills, emotional resilience, willingness to seek help from non-family sources, and refusal to accept diminished goals, were relatively rare among students who faced similar challenges. This recognition helped me understand that my success was not just the result of luck or external support, but reflected genuine personal strengths that I had developed through adversity. The most significant relationship I formed during college was with David Martinez, a graduate student in the School of Education, who was researching family engagement in educational planning and decision-making. David's background was similar to mine in some ways. He had grown up in a working-class family where higher education was valued but not well understood. But his parents had made significant sacrifices to support his educational goals rather than undermining them. Our conversations helped me understand how different family responses to educational opportunities could lead to vastly different outcomes for students with similar academic potential. David's research complemented my own interests in family financial counseling, and we began collaborating on projects that examined the intersection of family dynamics and educational access. Our work together helped me refine my understanding of the factors that distinguished supportive families from those that created obstacles for their children's educational goals. We identified communication patterns, financial planning strategies, and value systems that predicted positive outcomes, as well as warning signs that indicated potential problems in family educational support. The relationship with David also provided personal healing that I had not anticipated when I started college. His family welcomed me with warmth and genuine interest in my academic work and my personal goals. Spending time with a family that prioritized education and made sacrifices to support their children's dreams helped me understand what healthy family dynamics looked like and gave me a model for the kind of relationships I wanted to build in my own adult life. David's parents treated me as a valued member of their extended family, providing emotional support and encouragement that helped compensate for the lack of genuine support from my own parents. During my senior year, I applied for graduate programs in family counseling and social policy, with the intention of developing expertise that would allow me to help families avoid the kinds of destructive financial decisions that had nearly derailed my own education. My personal statement for these applications drew heavily on my undergraduate research and my experience with crisis management, presenting my background as preparation for professional work rather than simply personal trauma that I had overcome. The response from admissions committees was overwhelmingly positive, with several programs offering full funding and research assistantship. The decision to attend graduate school at Stanford School of Education allowed me to continue working with David and to maintain my connections with the undergraduate programs where I had been providing peer counseling. My graduate research focused on developing intervention strategies for families who were making financial decisions that could impact their children's educational opportunity. The goal was to create educational programs that would help parents understand the long-term consequences of their financial choices and provide them with tools for making decisions that supported rather than undermined their children's goals. The intervention programs I developed were tested with families in the San Francisco Bay Area who were facing various financial stressors that threatened their children's educational plan. The results were encouraging, showing that parents who participated in structured financial planning workshops were significantly less likely to make decisions that compromised their children's educational opportunity. The success of these pilot programs led to funding for larger-scale implementation and evaluation, establishing the foundation for what would become my professional career. During my graduate studies, I also maintained regular contact with Ms. Chen and the Great Lakes Educational Opportunity Fund, participating in their annual meetings and helping to evaluate applications from new scholarship candidates. This involvement allowed me to give back to the organization that had made my education possible, while also providing insight into the experiences of other students who were overcoming family obstacles to pursue higher education. Many of these students had stories that were similar to mine in various ways, confirming that family financial betrayal was a more common phenomenon than I had initially realized. The most satisfying part of my involvement with the scholarship program was mentoring recipients who were struggling with the emotional aftermath of family betrayal. Many of these students were dealing with guilt, anger, and confusion about how to maintain family relationships while protecting their own interests. My experience had taught me that healing from family betrayal was possible, but it required developing new definitions of family loyalty that prioritized honesty and mutual respect over unconditional sacrifice. These conversations helped other students develop healthier boundaries and more realistic expectations about family support. My doctoral dissertation research expanded on my undergraduate thesis work, examining the systemic factors that contributed to family financial dysfunction and developing policy recommendations for educational institutions and social service agencies. The research involved interviews with hundreds of families, analysis of educational outcome data, and collaboration with experts in family therapy, financial planning, and educational policy. The findings contributed to a growing body of literature about the relationship between family dynamics and educational access, and the work was published in several academic journals. The policy recommendations that emerged from my research focused on early intervention strategies that could help families develop healthy financial planning habits before crises occur. Rather than simply providing crisis counseling after family relationships had been damaged by poor financial decisions, the approach emphasized prevention through education and support for families who were beginning to face financial stress. The goal was to help parents understand how their financial choices would affect their children's future opportunities and to provide them with tools for making decisions that supported the entire family's long-term interests. After completing my doctoral degree, I accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that specialized in family financial counseling and educational advocacy. The organization's mission aligned perfectly with my personal experience and my professional expertise, and the work allowed me to apply my research findings to real-world situations where families were struggling with financial decisions that could impact their children's future. My colleagues were impressed by my ability to connect with clients who were dealing with family financial crises, and they recognized that my personal experience provided credibility that enhanced my professional effectiveness. The The most challenging cases in my professional practice involved families where parents had already made financial decisions that compromised their children's educational opportunities. These situations required helping parents understand the impact of their choices while also providing practical strategies for minimizing the damage and rebuilding trust with their children. The work was emotionally demanding because it required me to remain objective and supportive even when parents had made choices that were similar to those my own parents had made. One particularly memorable case involved a family where the father had used his daughter's college fund to cover gambling debts, a situation that was almost identical to what I had experienced with Jake's addiction and my parents' response. The daughter was academically talented and had been accepted to several competitive universities, but the family's financial crisis had made her college attendance impossible without significant external support. Working with this family required helping them develop communication strategies that would allow them to address the betrayal honestly while also focusing on practical solutions for funding the daughter's education. The outcome of this case was ultimately positive, with the daughter securing scholarship funding and attending her preferred university while maintaining a relationship with her parents that was based on honesty rather than pretense. The father committed to addressing his gambling addiction through professional treatment, and the family developed financial planning strategies that would prevent similar crises in the future. The daughter's success in college and her eventual career in social work demonstrated that family financial betrayal, while devastating, did not have to determine long-term outcomes if it was addressed constructively. My professional work also involved developing educational programs for high schools and community organizations designed to help families understand the importance of educational financial planning and to provide them with tools for making decisions that supported their children's goals. These programs were particularly effective in communities where higher education was valued but not well understood, because they provided practical information about college costs, financial aid, and family financial planning that many parents had never received. The success of these educational programs led to opportunities to consult with school districts, colleges, and social service agencies that were developing their own family financial counseling services. My expertise in both the research literature and the practical application of family financial counseling made me a sought-after speaker at conferences and workshops focused on educational access and family support. These speaking engagements allowed me to share my personal story as well as my professional expertise, helping other professionals understand the real-world impact of family financial decisions on students' educational opportunities. The relationship with my own family evolved gradually over the years following my college graduation, but it never returned to the trusting dynamic that had characterized my childhood. My parents expressed pride in my academic and professional achievements, and they seemed to understand that their financial decisions during my senior year of high school had been mistakes that had caused lasting damage to our relationship. However, they also appeared to believe that my success in overcoming the obstacles they had created somehow validated their choices or minimized the harm they had caused. Jake's recovery from gambling addiction was a long and difficult process that required several years of professional treatment and personal commitment to change. He eventually developed stable employment and healthy relationships, but his recovery was complicated by the need to rebuild trust with family members who had been harmed by his addiction. The relationship between Jake and me remained cordial but distant because we both understood that his choices had cost me years of security and trust that could never be fully restored. The most significant development in my family relationships occurred when my parents faced their own financial crisis several years after my college graduation. Dad's plumbing business experienced serious problems due to economic downturns and increased competition, and Mom's library position was eliminated due to budget cuts. They found themselves in a situation where they needed financial assistance, and they initially assumed that I would be willing to help them just as they had helped Jake during his gambling crisis. My response to their financial crisis was carefully considered and firmly bounded. I provided practical advice about financial planning and resource identification, but I did not provide direct financial assistance that would have enabled them to avoid the full consequences of their own financial decisions. This approach was consistent with the principles I had developed through my professional work with families facing financial crises,
and it reflected my understanding that enabling poor financial decisions ultimately harmed rather than helped the people making those decisions. My parents' reaction to my refusal to provide financial assistance was initially angry and disappointed, but they eventually came to understand that my approach was consistent with the lessons they had taught me through their own choices during Jake's crisis. They had demonstrated that family members were expected to absorb the consequences of each other's poor decisions, and they had prioritized immediate crisis resolution over long-term relationship health. My response applied the same principles to their situation, though I provided emotional support and practical guidance rather than simply abandoning them during their difficult. The resolution of my parents' financial crisis ultimately strengthened our relationship because it forced them to develop their own problem-solving skills and to take responsibility for their financial decisions rather than depending on family members to absorb the consequence. They secured employment in new fields, downsized their living expenses, and developed financial planning strategies that reflected their actual income and circumstance. The process was difficult and required significant lifestyle adjustments, but it resulted in greater financial stability and self-reliance than they had achieved when they were depending on family members to solve their financial problems. The most rewarding aspect of my professional career has been the opportunity to help families avoid the kinds of destructive patterns that characterized my own family's response to financial crisis. Through counseling, education, and policy development, I have been able to contribute to systemic changes that support healthy family financial decision-making and protect children's educational opportunities. The work has allowed me to find meaning and purpose in my own difficult experiences while also preventing other families from experiencing similar pain and disruption. The personal transformation that began with my smile during that final confrontation with my parents about community college was completed through years of education, professional development, and relationship building that taught me to trust my own judgment and to maintain healthy boundaries with people who did not consistently support my interests. The girl who had trusted her parents to protect her dreams had been replaced by a woman who understood that the most important protection comes from within, and that the most valuable relationships are those that are based on mutual respect rather than unconditional sacrifice. Looking back on the entire experience, I recognize that my parents' betrayal was devastating but also transformative in ways that ultimately served my long-term interests. The crisis forced me to develop independence, resilience, and self-advocacy skills at an earlier age than would have been necessary if my college funding had remained secure. These qualities have served me well throughout my adult life, and they have allowed me to help other people navigate similar challenges with greater confidence and effectiveness. The scholarship that made my Stanford education possible was more than just financial assistance. It was validation from successful adults who recognized my potential and were willing to invest in my future based on my character and determination rather than my family connections or circumstances. This experience taught me that worthwhile opportunities often come from unexpected sources and that persistence in pursuing goals can lead to outcomes that exceed original expectations. The phone call that Stanford's admissions office made to my parents during my freshman year, thanking them for raising such an exceptional daughter, remains one of the most satisfying moments of vindication in my entire life. The irony of the university expressing gratitude to parents who had actually tried to prevent my attendance was not lost on any of us, and it served as confirmation that my decision to pursue my goals despite family obstacles had been correct. That phone call represented the completion of my transformation from a victim of family betrayal to someone who had used that betrayal as motivation for extraordinary achievement. Today, when I work with families who are facing financial decisions that could impact their children's educational opportunities, I share my personal story as evidence that family financial betrayal does not have to determine long-term outcomes. The key is developing the skills and support systems necessary to pursue goals independently while maintaining realistic expectations about family relationships. Some families are able to learn from their mistakes and rebuild trust through honest communication and changed behavior. Others are not willing or able to make the changes necessary for healthy relationships, and in those cases, individual success depends on the ability to build alternative support systems and to maintain boundaries that protect personal interests. The most important lesson I learned through this entire experience is that love and support are not the same thing, and that family loyalty should not require accepting treatment that undermines your own interests or goals. Healthy relationships are characterized by mutual respect, honest communication, and consistent behavior that demonstrates genuine care for each other's well-being. When these characteristics are absent, individual survival and success depend on the ability to recognize the dysfunction and to develop alternative sources of support and guidance. The smile that I gave my parents when they tried to pressure me into accepting community college was the beginning of my understanding that their power to control my future was largely illusory and depended on my willingness to accept their limitations as my own. Once I recognized that my success would depend entirely on my own efforts and character, their approval or disapproval became irrelevant to my actual prospects. This realization was liberating and empowering, and it influenced every major decision I made throughout college and beyond. The transformation from a trusting daughter who depended on her parents' protection to an independent woman who understood that the most important promises are self-made was painful but ultimately necessary for my long-term success and happiness. The experience taught me that adversity can be a teacher if we are willing to learn from it, and that the strength developed through overcoming obstacles often exceeds what would have been possible through easier paths to the same destination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.